Pretty soon, hopefully, you're going to have a good idea of exactly what a healthy bee colony looks like. This looks pretty good. There's some empty spaces here, empty cells, but this is a pretty good brood pattern. You know, the queen laid in just about every cell. Maybe these are hygienic bees, so they're pulling out mites. Maybe that's why. Maybe some of these had pollen in them or something. But otherwise, that's pretty good. There's a little honey over the top. What's this down here at the bottom? Got some drones. So this means that times are good for these bees. They're getting a good diet, there's plenty of food out there, and they're able to raise drones, and they're converting some of their worker cells into drone cells because they want to, because they've got nothing to lose. And so this is a healthy colony. And then you look at the next colony, and it looks kind of like that. There's holes all over the place. The brood nest is much smaller. There is a little honey at the top, but there's no drone brood. This one is not doing as well. When you see something like this, you don't necessarily know what's going on, but it should prompt you to look a little bit closer. A poor brood pattern could be caused by really hygienic bees that are overly expressing that trait, and anytime a larva sneezes, they kill it and get rid of it. So that's a little too much of a good thing there. We don't want that. It could be brood diseases. There are several of them, which I'll talk about. And it could be that these larvae are dying and they're pulling them out. Sometimes you get an inbred queen. If she mates with her own brother, sometimes you get a condition where it produces fertilized eggs, but they are actually triploid drones. And so the workers say, that's a worker-sized cell, but there's a dude in there, that ain't right. And so they kill it and they remove it. And so you see all these empty spaces in there. The queen is doing her best. She's laying eggs, fertilized eggs in every cell, but the workers are pulling them out because there's problems with them. When you go closer to the brood, the cap brood should look nice and uniform, domes up just slightly over the surface of the comb, but otherwise, nice solid pattern. The larvae themselves should look pearly white and healthy. If they look unhealthy, they are unhealthy. So you should recognize what good-looking brood looks like. Is this good-looking brood? No. That's one of your worst nightmares as a beekeeper, to open up a box and find that. This is called American foulbrood. This is a bacterial disease, and this disease right here is the reason there is inspection services in every state, and the reason you have to register your bee yards and have them inspected before they move around, because if this stuff gets out into the population, it can spell doom for a lot of people. It can take out an entire operation pretty quickly, or all the beekeepers in town could succumb to this pretty quickly. Well, not the beekeepers, but their bees. It's caused by a bacterial spore that gets in there, and it's highly resistant to anything. Extremes of heat and cold and dirty looks. About the only way to get rid of it is gamma radiation. And unless you've got a bunch of that around, then it's going to be kind of difficult. Some states used to have a traveling trailer that actually would irradiate beekeeping equipment. They would drive from farm to farm and do that, but that's really expensive, and they don't do that anymore. I don't think in any states. But if a beekeeper had some of this going on in their operation, all their bees died, they might have said, well, I'm done. I had a good run, but I'm old, I'm tired, forget about it. Put it in the barn. 20 years can go by. They sit in the barn, it's 120 in there in the summer, it freezes all winter, and then little grandson comes along. I want to keep bees, Grandpa. Well, sure, you can have all my old equipment. The wax moths ate all the comb, but everything else is still good. It's been dry, and so he saves his allowance, gets a paper route, whatever kids do these days, I don't know, Venmo, whatever, but they get some bees, they put them in there. Soon they all die because the spores from this bacteria are still in there. 20 years later, they've just been dormant, just waiting to be swallowed by a honeybee. So they can remain on the comb and on the woodenware for a long time. The USDA has a bee disease lab, and I think they've got a piece of comb that's over 75 years old, and every so often they still check it, and sure enough, it still makes bees sick. So the larvae ingest these spores, in contaminated food. It only affects the larva. It doesn't affect the adult bees. So the nurse bees are feeding the larva, they're walking around on this contaminated comb and they're tracking it down into the cells, and so the larvae are consuming it and then they get sick and they die right after the cell is capped off. And so that's why the cappings look kind of sunken in, because there's a nasty rotting larva inside. It's extremely lethal and contagious to honeybees, not to you or your children or your pets or anything else, only to honeybees. But it's found in a lot of store-bought honeys, especially honeys shipped here from overseas. A lot of big commercial operations that have had this problem, they use all kinds of antibiotics and stuff to keep it under control, but it never really goes away. And so that honey may contain these spores. And if you buy honey from the grocery store and feed it to your bees and you don't know where that honey's been, you may get this disease in your beehives. So never feed your bees strange honey. It's okay to feed them your honey if you're convinced it's safe, but never go get weird honey and give it to them. Detection is usually visual. You see these sunken perforated cappings. They have holes in them because a bee probably comes along and says, something's not right, and pokes a hole and then says, oh, that's awful. And then says, I need a house cleaning bee over here, cell 412. I'll be outside. Sometimes you see what are called pupal tongues, and that's this little thing that sticks up here. We call it a tongue. It's not really part of the larva. It's like a little shriveled up part, but they call it a tongue, but it kind of sticks up from the bottom. And sometimes you see that, sometimes you don't. But one surefire thing you're going to detect is the odor. It smells awful. And if you've ever smelled it, you'll recognize it again, and it'll churn your stomach. It really smells nasty. It's kind of sulfurous, decaying rot. And it's all these decaying larvae that are inside there. And you can check it with what's called the ropiness test. For that, you'll need a toothpick or a wooden match or some little twig that size. And you find a cell that you suspect has this disease, and you just put your matchstick in there and swirl it around and then draw it out slowly, and it will rope out. It'll stretch out about 3/4 of an inch. So it looks nasty, but it's real gooey and gummy, and it'll stretch out before it snaps off. If it does that, chances are pretty good that you've got American foulbrood going on in there. And if that's the case, if you even suspect it, that's when you need to call your bee inspector. Call over to the plant board, tell them what you think you've got. They take it very seriously, and they'll come very quickly, and they'll check it out. You can get these antibody tests where you smear a little bit around and it changes colors, but these are kind of expensive, and they don't have a long shelf life, so don't buy one because you'll probably never need it, and when you call the bee inspector, he's going to bring one anyway, and he'll use it for free, so you don't need those. The dead larvae, though, they kind of melt down in there and form what we call a scale. It's like a little tough blob of tar, and it's difficult for the bees to remove, but they still try to, because bees are very tidy. And the adult bees don't succumb to this disease, so they try to clean it out. And as they do, they get it all over their feet, and they track it all over the combs, and the larvae are all dying. So the nurse bees, they get older, they forage, then they die. Well, they're not being replaced. So the population in the hive is going down because none of the children are growing up. So as the population goes down, what happens? They get robbed out by other bees. Now, where's the honey in the hive? It's up in the top. How do you get there? You walk across these combs that are covered with bacterial spores that are impossible to kill. So the robbing bees walk up, grab some honey, walk down, fly back home. Now they're in your hive. Where do they go? They walk up, they deposit their honey, they walk back down through your brood nest, then they come back and get some more. But on the way out, they say, hey, everybody, follow me. Do the little waggle dance, and now you've got thousands of bees over here robbing it out, taking it back home to your hive. Your hives start to die, other bees rob them out, and so this is how this spreads so rapidly. Luckily, there is a treatment for this that's very effective. And most of you probably have access to some at home. We call it fire. You are legally required to dig a hole and burn those hives in place and bury them a foot deep, bury the ashes. That is the cure for American foulbrood. You don't burn them on top of the ground because wax burns really well, but wax and honey just go everywhere. As soon as it cools down, then every bee in the apiary is all over it. If you don't have the courage to set fire to all your bees that you love, don't worry, most of them are about dead anyway, but the apiary inspector has a hard heart and he'll come and do it. A cup of kerosene will help, but most bee equipment goes up pretty quickly. They usually spray soapy water in there. That kills the bees really fast, the last remaining ones, and then they'll light it up. But it's sad, it's heartbreaking. It's never happened to me personally, but if it did, I would do it because I do not want to ever use that equipment again, and I don't want those spores to get in my other beehives, and I sure don't want them to get into any of yours. And if any of you ever had this disease and you lived in my neighborhood, by golly, I'd be over there with a flamethrower because I don't want that stuff coming into my yard either. So this is how we protect all of us. In the old days, they told you to treat all of your hives every spring and every fall with antibiotics. That was not a good idea for a lot of reasons. It built up resistant strains that were resistant to antibiotics, but antibiotics do not cure this disease. This disease has an infective spore form and a vegetative form that just kind of sits around and does nothing until the medication wears out, and then it flips over into the other form and infects the bees again. So you can feed this to your bees and all it does is hide the symptoms. So you can keep your bees alive by pumping them full of antibiotics, but it doesn't really get rid of it. Genetic stocks of bees can help. There's one called the Minnesota Hygienic, was developed at the University of Minnesota by a scientist there, Marla Spivak, and she bred these bees to be resistant to this American foulbrood disease, and it actually works pretty well. As soon as those larvae start to get sick, these bees are able to detect that at a really early stage. They'll uncap that cell before it dies, yank it out, and get rid of it before it can become a source of infection for the whole hive. And so that can actually keep bee operations pretty healthy. Another disease is called European foulbrood. It's not quite as bad. They both came from Europe, but the nasty one got named after us for some reason. Aristotle actually wrote a treatise on honeybees and mentioned American foulbrood, so maybe it should be Greek foulbrood, I don't know. But this one is European foulbrood. It's another bacterial disease. In this case, again, the larva consumes spores and contaminated food, but the larva dies before the cell is capped. So you can see the larva in there look like they're going wrong. These bacteria do not form that long-lived spore. So you can get a colony to recover from a fairly mild infection if you catch it early enough. And this is usually a springtime disease, so this is the time of year that you would be seeing it, March, April, sometimes into May, and you want to catch it quickly. The way you spot it is usually visually. You might see a spotty brood pattern, so I mentioned that when you see a lot of holes, that could be a brood disease. Well, this is one that it's not real common, but it's not real uncommon. We do see it every year. So what you see when you look down in the cells is that the larvae are just melting and twisting, and they're discolored, and eventually they start to just writhe around and they look like they're in pain. If you ever had like really bad food poisoning and you felt like you just wanted to die, that's probably what this little guy feels like. You can actually see the tracheal tubes inside their skin there as their inside of their body gets dark, but they melt down, and sometimes people call it snot brood for some reason, but it kind of turns out like that. They die before the cells are capped, and they form a scale, but it's kind of a lighter color rubbery scale, and the bees are pretty good at removing it and getting rid of it, but in the process of doing that, they do get spores on them and they track it around, and as they're feeding other larvae, sometimes that it can spread. So it's not quite as virulent as American foulbrood, but still it's definitely one to be concerned about, and you want to clean it up as soon as you see it. This one does not pass that ropiness test. If you stick a match down in there and swirl it around, it's not going to stretch out like the American foulbrood. And again, they do make a test for that, but don't invest in those. Let your bee inspector bring one. If you are diagnosed, if your hive is diagnosed with this, again, call your bee inspector. But if it is European foulbrood, you can treat it with an antibiotic. But in recent years, the FDA has changed all the laws on veterinary antibiotics. You used to be able to get this over the counter, but they were overusing it in the livestock industry, and so now you have to have a veterinarian give you what's called a veterinary feed directive. It's kind of like a prescription for an animal, and then you can get some from your local farm store. But you would have to get a vet to come out to your place, look at it, and then write you a prescription, and then you go get some, and so it can take several days. We do have a list of veterinarians now. We've been training them in bee medicine, believe it or not, and so if you need that, I have that information available to you, and so does your bee inspector. But you mix this stuff with sugar, and you sprinkle it around the outside edges of the hive like this, and then you take your queen and you put her in a cage, or you kill her and you order a new queen. Get some fresh genetics in there. Some genetic lines are much more susceptible than others to this, but you want to requeen or cage your queen, and what you're doing is breaking the brood cycle. Sometimes you hear that term. That means that you don't let the queen lay any eggs for a couple of weeks, and then all the larvae in here that are susceptible die. All the ones that are not get to pupate and live happily. But meanwhile, the bees are eating all this medication, and it kind of cleans it out of their system. If you can't get antibiotics, then you can still get rid of this disease by caging your queen, and then, or removing her and getting a new one. Shake all the bees, all the adult bees out onto brand new equipment, a new hive body, new frames, new foundation, and get rid of the old combs. And then feed them heavily with sugar syrup for a couple of weeks, and then release the queen. And what happens is, because there's no brood in there at all, these bees have nothing to do except sip on syrup and produce wax, which they'll do because it's all foundation. And so they're waiting for that queen to be released, and as they are processing all of that nectar, then they're just gonna kind of get it all out of their system. This usually works pretty well. Not 100% of the time, but usually within 2 weeks, it'll be okay. All those combs that you got rid of, cut the wax out, get rid of it. You can melt it down and use it to make candles or something if you filter it, but don't paint it back onto new foundation. It does have those spores in there. You wouldn't want to risk it. But let the queen out and let her start laying eggs again. Another brood disease is called Chalkbrood, and this one is a fungal disease, and the bees can catch it by contacting the spores or ingesting it. When a larva dies, this stuff just goes right through them. It just kind of digests their whole body, and the little fungal hyphae grow all through it and forms spores, what we call sporulating bodies, when it reaches the surface, and it pops out, and so it looks like they're covered in dust. Or they call them a chalky mummy, which is why it's called Chalkbrood. So these are down inside the cells, and sometimes the bees, you might see them, it looks like they've pulled their heads off trying to get them out, but a lot of times you'll see them down here on the landing board. And this was a disease that we would usually see in the early spring when things are still kind of cool and wet. Notice this hive is sitting on the ground. Mushrooms like dark, cool, wet conditions, and so that's perfect for fungi. And so getting our hives up off the ground and using screen bottom boards has seemed to go a long way to getting rid of this disease. But this is usually the first place you're going to see it, is when they're putting it outside on the landing board. But elevate and ventilate your hives, and the bees will pull them out and get rid of them. And usually when we have good weather, lots of flowers in bloom, this disease just kind of goes away on its own. If it's something that you see year after year after year, then you've just got so many spores in your hive, you should change out all the comb and try to get rid of it. But usually it's not a big issue, it's just one of those things to watch out for. Nosema disease, on the other hand, can be a big issue. There's two different kinds. One called Nosema apis, which is the old standard European version we've had forever. It was easy to spot, it was easy to treat, and now it's almost entirely replaced by Nosema cerana, which is kindly donated by the Asian honeybees. Again, just like varroa mites, we get a lot of diseases from those bees. It's a microsporidian. It's a single-celled organism that has this long coiled-up tube inside of itself, and it just sits around basically and waits to be swallowed by a honeybee. And when it is swallowed by a honeybee, it springs into action literally and shoots that thing out like a harpoon and stabs the poor honeybee on the inside of its stomach. And then it starts going to work. Imagine this is the cross-section of a bee's stomach, each of the little cells that digest their dinner. And if a bee swallows these spores, then it stabs the cell, and then the entire contents of that cell squeezes down that filament and injects itself into the bee's stomach cell. Then hijacks it like a virus and forces it to make copies of itself and digest the cell. As it goes, eventually it makes lots of copies until there's nothing left, and then it breaks open and releases all the spores into the middle of the bee's stomach. You're looking quite aghast, like I can't believe that would happen. Nature is pretty wild. It takes several million of these spores to really make a bee sick. You know, they have lots of cells in their stomach, not 15 like I drew here, but you know, this has to build up. It has to go through several cycles, and it takes a little while, but when it does finally happen, then of course this is going to do quite a number on the bee. Think about what's going on with this bee. Here's its honey crop, the midgut, and the hindgut. This is the bee's intestinal system here. So this is where they digest all their food, this is where they carry honey, and this is where wastes are stored until they can get outside. Nosema apis was usually an overwintering disease, so when bees were stuck inside, all of these spores would build up until something finally cut loose. Now, in a healthy bee, everything's okay, but when Nosema starts to destroy the lining of the stomach, a bee can't absorb any nutrients, so they get weak, they're hungry, they're swallowing food, but they're not getting anything out of it, so they're still hungry. Anything that they swallow just passes through and winds up in the hindgut. An overwintering bee with no indoor plumbing is going to have some problems because that hindgut is just getting so full until something's got to give. And they're getting weaker and weaker because they can't absorb any nutrients. So these bees are not happy. So on the outside of the hive on a warm day, sometimes they sneak out and they just barely get out before they turn loose with everything in their bowels and go back in. And you would see all these spots all over the side of your hive, and the outside looks bad, the inside looks even worse. But bees are very tidy. They try to clean up after themselves and after each other. And of course, they don't have little scrub brushes and mops in there. Animals clean themselves with their tongues. This disease spreads when they swallow spores. So bees are cleaning up after other bees, and that's how this spreads from bee to bee until it's going on through the whole hive. Also remember that bees are constantly sharing food with each other, mouth to mouth, by trophallaxis, so they can also spread this disease that way. So the Nosema apis was easy to see, and it was pretty easy to treat too with a medication, but the Nosema cerana will actually strike any time of year, and it seems to be really stress related. So a lot of times this is kind of hidden in a hive that doesn't seem to be in bad shape, but when they become stressed because of any other conditions going on, either poor nutrition or too many mites or other diseases in the hive, then they become very susceptible to this nosema. Also, when they are exposed to fungicides and miticides, then they're a lot more susceptible to this, which is a problem for bees that are going to California to pollinate almonds and things like that, or other fruit trees. They get exposed to all these chemicals, we're giving them miticides, and then this disease can really take hold. This Fumidil was kind of the old standby. It worked really great against Nosema apis. It doesn't seem to work as well against Nosema cerana, but you would mix it into the syrup, you'd feed it to the colony in the fall. all winter long. It's in there and they would consume it and they would kind of medicate themselves. This is not honey that you would want for human consumption, but it's just winter food. But it doesn't seem to work as well against the Nosema in the winter. You can use it as a spring treatment, so as your bees come out of winter, you see they're not doing well, there's these streaks and spots all over the hive, you can give them a quart of syrup that's got this stuff in it, but you got to make sure that they're not doing this during the honey flow. They need to consume all that medicated syrup 4 weeks before you can put a honey super on there to ensure that it's all been digested and it's out of their systems. And basically, most of those bees are dead anyway that had it, but this can keep your hive alive and you can keep going. This stuff is called Nosema. It's also sold in the bee catalogs. It's made from, I don't even know, some kind of Eastern European tree bark from Croatia or something. I've never been able to find a paper in English that actually specifies how well it works, but it's one of those things that they swear does some good. Probably changes the pH or the gut chemistry, making it less habitable for Nosema spores, but I don't know. I don't have any firsthand knowledge with that, and I'm not sure I've ever met anybody who's used it, but you may see that when advertised. The best thing for bees is diet and exercise, just like the rest of us. They need access to the outside, they can fly around and they can void themselves and take a cleansing flight, and they need good food, good fresh nectar and pollen. So when those conditions are met, typically we don't have a big problem. But this affects their overall health and it will kind of help keep this disease at bay. I've mentioned viruses a few times, and there are quite a few of them. One in particular you might notice is called Chalkbrood virus. If you ever see a larva that looks like it's sitting in the cell with a teeny tiny shrunken head with bulging eyes, this is Chalkbrood virus. And it's basically a water balloon full of virus particles. If you rupture that, then they go everywhere and release billions more, and as they clean it up, they spread it around. There's no cure for this. The best thing you can do is kill your queen. Put in a new queen. And it breaks the brood cycle and you get some fresh genetics in there. That almost always works. Just get a completely unrelated queen. Don't let them raise their own queen from the same genes. Get a new one that is unrelated, and that almost always works, and that's about the only cure that we have for that. Deformed wing virus is one of the few that you can see the symptoms in an adult bee, and the only way to stop that is to control parasitic mites, which spread this disease from one generation to the next. There's one called black queen cell virus that you're very unlikely to see unless you are a queen breeder. If you're making a lot of queens, this one tends to come out, but occasionally you might see it. And it's a virus. It doesn't respond to antibiotics, but the old standby cure was to give your hive antibiotics because it kind of cleans up all of the background bacteria and other germs that those bees have, and then their own immune system seem able to get rid of this virus. So it's kind of a backwards way of thinking, but it's what's always seemed to work with the bees. But there's lots of other ones. There's even one called Arkansas paralysis virus, which was discovered in England from bees that were shipped over from Arkansas. They've even discovered new viruses in recent years because we've been looking so hard at all the things going wrong with bees. But most of them don't have symptoms that you can recognize. Some called paralysis virus that makes them tremble and shake and not really be able to fly. There's some that make them look kind of greasy and oily, but for most of them, they just shorten their lifespan, make them less efficient, and the whole colony doesn't do as well. But again, there's no medical cure. Most often they're spread by mites, so keep your mites under control. It keeps the viruses under control, and hygienic stocks of bees can help.